Thank you, Melinda. We now have Annette Michaux, the Director at the Parenting Research Centre. Annette leads significant evidence-informed policy and practice initiatives that help PRC clients achieve their intended outcomes. Annette directs a number of government-funded national multi-year initiatives. We love a multi-year initiative.
We love a multi-year.
We all love multi-year initiatives. Lost my place. Including the PRC's contribution to Emerging Minds, the National Workforce Centre for Child Mental Health, and the Reframing Parenting Initiative. Annette has over 20 years of experience in child and family practice, policy and research management, including having served as General Manager of Social Policy and Research at the Benevolent Society, as CEO of the New South Wales Child Protection Council, and as a Senior Policy Staff at the New South Wales Commission for Children and Young People. She's also worked in a frontline child welfare and community development role in the UK and Australia. Can we give Annette a round of applause, please? Welcome.
Thank you. It's an absolute delight to be here, and I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and any Aboriginal people in the room with us today. So I'm here to talk about a little bit more about practice frameworks, and I'm so glad Annette Boyes is here to talk about some of the work we've done together. So if you've got any questions, ask Annette, because she's putting a lot of this stuff into practice. But I'm here really to talk about the engagement element of the work we've been talking about. So that's definitely one of the key elements in the Elements project, and it's also a key aspect of the work we do with agencies around developing practice frameworks. So I've got 3 key points. The first is that we all need a structure or framework in which to put our elements or our evidence-based programs or our practices. So I'll talk briefly about what I mean by that. The second point is engaging effectively with families. Means we have to move from principles and quite high-level things, which took to the point from Bethany Family Services over here, to some of the micro skills that are needed. So moving from principle to micro skills that we need to see practitioners actually practicing to make change with families. And also, we actually need to change the conversation we have about parents and parenting in Australia. So I'll talk very briefly about some macro research we've been doing with the Frameworks Institute. Obviously, the evidence really shows very clearly that we need to engage with families in family-focused, goal-orientated service delivery if we want to get better outcomes for kids, particularly around things that we're all very interested in, for example, restoration of children to their homes, or in mental health services, getting families to really participate and then move towards the goals and outcomes they want. So there's a really important imperative based on some really, there's some strong evidence in some areas and emerging areas, evidence in others around kind of goal setting and getting families the outcomes they want. So my first point is around this structure that we need around the practices that we put in place with families. We think workers need a how to do things, not just a what to do. So just giving people a practice in a bit of a void is probably not going to work. So giving them an element without a framework, and we've learned this at PRC over kind of years of trial and error, that really people do need a process or a framework in which to insert their work. And I'm talking about a practice framework here, not the broader issues around HR or case management, but the actual practice. And an example is, we're heavily involved in the implementation of Safe Care in New South Wales. It's the biggest implementation internationally. And what we found there is the practitioners in Safe Care who kind of are able to hit the ground running and really move that program through are the ones that have really good engagement skills. Hello, it's not rocket science, but the ones that can really take Safe Care and move through Safe Care modules effectively are the ones who have these kind of engagement and collaboration skills. So the evidence-based program can work really effectively, but it works more effectively where the workers have these skills. So the framework's not an evidence-based program, it's actually a vehicle in which you can insert elements or evidence-based programs or practices. So engaging families is such a key element. It's kind of the first step in the practice frameworks we work on. So with the New South Wales Government at the moment, part of their big reform is around out-of-home care, and we're developing a practice framework for the NGO sector around restoration, open adoption and guardianship to help guide these kind of micro skills in practice by putting a framework around them. But I'd also like to say you can have the best process model, but unless you're inserting within that practices that work, it's not going to be effective. So these two elements, what we're talking about today, really need to come together. The second kind of point is around effectively engaging, taking that from kind of principles to some of the micro skills that practitioners need. And to do that, we really need to define effective engagement practice. And I know the work we did with Windermere spent a lot of time working out what practice meant, what was being done on the ground and how that could be enhanced towards particular goals. So a parent can really like you and like the way you work and be very satisfied with your interactions with them. But unless you're making progress towards achieving outcomes, it's not really going to be effective for that family. So instead of thinking about engagement just as the collaboration, we like to think that there's the extent to which the parent is actively occupied in the work of achieving the goals they, not you, have decided are important. So successful engagement, what does success look like? There's kind of three elements. In terms of that presenting issue or concern, the parent sees and believes the issue you might work on together is going to be important and deserving of their attention. So the second area of what success looks like for the parent is that there's a helping relationship, that they feel like they can collaborate with you, and there's a trusting relationship emerging, and you can work together to solve problems. So it's not just the trust on its own, but there's a way you can work together to solve problems. And thirdly, the parents accepting the need to kind of engage in a change process with the worker. So kind of starting to accept responsibility for a change process. And this really means that in that engagement process, it's really important to engage in the issues that are important to the parent. I mean, that sounds so obvious, but it's really interesting when we review some of those initial conversations that workers enter into with parents. We often find workers talking about their concerns rather than actively listening and bringing out the concern that the parent might have and what the parent wants to work on. We also know that engagement isn't fixed. It kind of goes up and down. So people can be very engaged one week, but there's a lot of stuff going on, which means they're not so engaged the next week. And also, engagement's modifiable. We can do things as professionals. That means that we can really do things to establish and build engagement. And the other thing to note is that engagement is part of our role as professionals. It's not about families being hard to reach, but it's about what is the very best we can do, what's the very best process we can use by utilising some of those skills to engage effectively with parents. So we're responsible for that good process. Ultimately, the parent's responsible for deciding whether or not they want to enter into a process with us, but if we do the very best around process, we've got a better chance of engaging. So there's two key aspects of the work during that engagement period. Identifying what the issue is, as I said, from the parent's perspective, and really turning that issue into a solvable problem, something that can be worked on, that you can really roll your sleeves up on together and work on. So I'm not talking about assessment or the kind of history of harm. I'm really talking about the here and now issue and problem that the parent has and wants to work on. Obviously, in a child protection context, you have to put that together with coming in with some concern, if there are concerns about the child. But it's really important that together you find a project or a thing that you want to work on together. I haven't got time to go through the practice elements, but there's 5 key practice elements that we talk about during the engagement phase, and have a lot of kind of detailed support for practitioner around the conversations that bring these things out. So things like engaging with parent concerns and how you effectively do that, refining intentions and issues and turning them into problems that can be solved, understanding where the parent's at with that issue, understanding the context in which they're living, the context of the problem, and developing an agreement, so doing some goal setting together. And that is all before you move on to that motivating stage that you talked about, motivational interviewing. So getting that goal sorted, then you can work on the change process using motivational interviewing kind of techniques. So that clarifying the intention phase we see as really important, and we just try and slow workers down to try and really listen, to clarify what it is that that parent or carer wants to work on. And sometimes and when we say that it's significant time, we don't mean 6 months, we mean 2 or 3 sessions rather than 5 minutes in a child welfare context. I know someone said, oh, Warren does that in 3 minutes, doesn't he? No, he doesn't. But there are ways to do this that are quicker than, sometimes people taking many, many months to engage. We really believe you can engage much faster than that. And the way you set that project up is really important. The work you're going to do with that client, really deeply listening and using some of those skills before you start embarking on the change journey. So getting that project right before you start to embark on the change, and really checking that's what the parent wants to work on. So turning something from a vague issue like I'm really stressed out to what is the situation where that's affecting you in relation to your kids. Well, my kids are just battling it out every morning, to turning that into a problem. How do we make mornings before school something that's calmer and easier to cope with? And then you can work on some behaviours. So that's kind of just a really quick snapshot of the kind of work we try to do to really bring out what are some of those micro skills and things that are a bit more useful and beyond the principles, those principles that we talked about earlier. So we're all on the same journey, I think, with these things. Finally, the third thing, through some work we've been doing around the conversation about parenting in Australia, and this is with the Frameworks Institute, where they talked, where they talked to about 7,600 Australians about their views on parenting and how they thought about parenting. And what that showed is, in a nutshell, we really need to change the conversation about parenting in Australia, moving from talking about how important parenting is, how parents need support, that parenting, it's a skill that can be learned, all the things we said for years at the Parenting Research Centre actually. Instead of starting with that, starting with children and why their development is important. So start with children, what children need to thrive and how parents support that. And that reframe not only gets the public more likely to support our initiatives and policies, but it also means parents are more likely to come forward and access our services. Because the way we think about raising kids in Australia is very much about, it's a very private matter, it's just about caring, it's instinctual. If you're a good person, you'll be a good parent, so why would you need help? Surely there's something wrong with you if you do. And if you were raised by a shitty parent, you will be a shitty parent yourself. So it's very deterministic. So this kind of just breaks that and stops people from going into a very unproductive way of thinking about parenting. So what does that mean for us as services? It means some of the ways we present ourselves on our website, some of the brochures we use, we probably need to stop talking about how hard parenting is, how we can help you with your parenting, and start by talking about children and how we can help you to help your children thrive. So it is quite a flip. It's not a hard flip, but it is a flip, and that's another piece of work we're on a journey with a number of jurisdictions to try and help change those communications. And in relation to engagement, if we do that, we are more likely to get families who really need our support and help through the door. So I will stop there and hand back to Benji. Thank you.
Thanks, Annette. I mean, today in many ways a taster, and there's lots of, there's Robin's conference coming up, there'll be the Open Symposium coming up. We really hope to take some of these things through the year because they need a lot of exploration. Just that commentary on what does it mean to be a parent. I mean, we could talk all day just about that. So thank you. That was really fantastic.